Let's get into Scripture. As you know, a couple weeks back, we started this new series where we're kind of basing it on that Experiencing God Bible study that goes all the way back to the 90s. And like many things in Christianity, it's here today, it's a big deal, it's a fad, and then it's gone tomorrow and people forgot. Truth, and especially significant, important, life-changing truth, shouldn't be forgotten. But sadly, a lot of it is in evangelical Christianity. We go from like fad to fad to fad to fad. And so I thought this would be a good idea for where we are as a church family. And the whole idea of experiencing God is we're moving away from self-direction and self-control. We want to have a God-directed, God-controlled life. And the study itself is built on 7 realities. And we're going to get to number 5 today. But number 1, all around us, God is at work all the time. What does that mean? That means I don't have to think about, well, what should I do? I should recognize God is at work all around me. He wants to have a personal, continuing, very intimate, experiential relationship with every one of us, and He invites us to join Him in His ongoing work. And the way He does that is He reveals Himself to us. And that's how we know what He wants to do in us and what He wants to do through us. Now this morning, we get to reality number 5. And that is when God calls us, when God invites us to join Him in His work, it really does create a crisis of belief. That crisis triggered by 2 things. First of all, God's call colliding with my sense of inadequacy, my sense of feeling that this is too much, it's overwhelming, it's beyond me. That's part of the crisis. The other part of the crisis is this is outside my comfort zone. And I'm very comfortable with the status quo. And now God is messing with the status quo, and He's calling me into this endeavor that's outside my comfort zone. I'm not real comfortable with that. If you remember, a couple weeks ago, we focused in on Moses and God calling him from the burning bush. And here's what I'm getting at in today's study. There's a reason why Moses was in Midian. To go to Egypt, as God was calling him, was risky. It was scary. He was wanted for murder in Egypt. And Moses has a choice to make because he can't stay in Midian where he's comfortable and go to Egypt where God is calling him. He has to make a choice. And often in our lives, that choice is very difficult. That's why we call it a crisis. Now, some of the symptoms of the crisis include things like when God calls, we start thinking, this is impossible. No way, this is not possible. I could never do something like that. And then the internal dialogue starts. You remember when God called Moses, what did he do? He started to make excuses, right? And we can think of 100 reasons why this is a really bad idea and it will not work. And so maybe, God, you should get someone else, or maybe you should think of something else. Why? Because there's this tension between my comfort zone and my sense of security and all of the risk and all of the uncertainties and all of the, what might happen if we actually step out in obedience. And so we wait for what we might call certainty. A guarantee that absolutely this is going to work. And here's what we need to understand for this morning. We're never going to have an experiential relationship with God, the kind that he intends, the kind that he desires, until we can overcome that crisis. And so that's going to be our focus this morning. And we're going to start by trying to make sure we understand the crisis. And we begin in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 1. Because we just got done saying one of the symptoms is we're looking for certainty. We're looking for absolute assurance that, hey, this is going to work. This is where faith comes in. Look at what verse 1 says about faith. Faith is being sure of what you hope for. It's being certain of what you do not see. The kind of crisis we're talking about requires faith. And here, the author of Hebrews tells us what faith is and what faith does. Faith gives us assurance. Faith gives us that feeling of certainty. The exact thing we need to move forward. Because that's what faith is, and that's what faith does. Now look at verse 6. Without faith, it's impossible to please God. And in the context of our study, if we're talking about, okay, what pleases God? We could have, a list with 100 different things on there, right? For this particular study where we're focused on experiencing God, we already know God desires a ongoing, personal, loving relationship with each one of us. So we can say that pleases God, right? Without faith, you can't please God. Without faith, you're never going to have that kind of experiential relationship that he intends and desires. Why? Because faith is what allows us to move forward when we're having that crisis experience. Without faith, it's impossible to please God. Why? Because when we come to God, we must believe that he is. That's for a bunch of evangelical Christians, that is not a challenge, is it? We believe God exists. You also have to believe that he will reward those who earnestly seek him. The idea being when he's calling us and we're in the midst of that crisis, we need the faith that gives us the assurance and the certainty so that we can join him in his work, even though we can't see how it's going to work out. Because of our faith in God, we know it will. And that's described in that last phrase, that he rewards those who earnestly seek him. That my faith allows me to move forward because I believe when I accept God's invitation, when I join him in his work, I am going to see him do the kind of things that only he can do through me. When we have that kind of faith, we're able to overcome the crisis. Now, we're trying to understand the crisis. So let's talk about that for a little bit in the context of Hebrews 11, 1 and 6. First of all, we should recognize this crisis is intentional. And I say that because what are we doing? We're moving away from self-reliance to a faith where God is now in control, God is now directing, my life is now revolving around him. I'm not longer, faith is the belief in things that I hope for, things that I can't see. So I'm moving away from I can see it, it makes sense, it's logical, it's rational, to a faith-directed life or a faith approach to life. And the more I do that, the more uncomfortable I will be. So it's intentional. God is stretching us. He's intentionally taking us out of our comfort zone. So when we experience this crisis, we should understand that's called normal. There's nothing wrong with you when you have that hesitancy, when you have that resistance. That's called normal. There's nothing wrong with you. It's the next step in your spiritual development. And I say that because what we're talking about here are God-sized moments. If you're like me, and I don't want to say most of us are like me, and you should be very glad you're not like me, but when it comes to whether it's an opportunity or the task at hand, I know myself, I'm very comfortable with the idea of, okay, when an opportunity or a task presents itself, I tend to evaluate it. I tend to formulate some kind of plan based on my abilities, based on my resources, based on my schedule, that sort of thing. And then I work the plan. And I think most of us are pretty similar in that sense. We evaluate things based on, well, here's the kind of stuff I can do. Here's the kind of stuff I have experience with. Here's where I'm comfortable. Here's my time allotment and all of that. But there's a lot of limitation there, is there not? And so sometimes a task comes along, an opportunity comes along, and in the evaluation process, I rule it out. It's like, well, that may be a great opportunity for somebody, but not for me because it's too much. And we just rule things out. And we rule them out based on what we perceive we are able to do. The issue here is not what you and I are able to do. The issue here is what can God do through us if we give him a chance. And the reality is, if I'm looking at a situation and I'm coming up with my plan and I can see how reasonable and logical and all of that, I can see how it's going to work. If I can see all of that, is faith necessary? Nope, I can see it. Faith operates in areas where I can't see the conclusion, but I trust God will work in the process to get there, even though I can't see it. And when you're dealing with God-sized moments, where our instinct is like, well, I can't. That's where we need faith. Not a blind faith, not a stupid faith, but a faith that says, you know what? This really does seem impossible. And if I were doing this on my own, it would be impossible. But I'm not doing it on my own. God has made a promise. I can do all things through Christ. He will give me the strength. And so maybe I can't, but in Jesus Christ, I can. You see, there really is a difference between faith and fear. Fear focuses on self. Fear focuses on things like inadequacy and limitation. Fear focuses on our personal comfort. And faith is very different. Faith focuses on God. And when you believe that God is who he claims to be. Now, who is that? Well, he's the one that says nothing is impossible with God, right? He's the one that said, I can do all things through Christ. He will give me the strength. He's the one that said, I can do exceedingly abundantly beyond anything you could ever ask or think. So if I believe that he is who he claims to be, that he can do the kind of things that he says that he can do, well, all of a sudden there's no limitation there. There's no inadequacy, not because I am not inadequate, not because I am not weak. I'm inadequate. I am weak for many things God has called me to do. But where I am weak and where I am inadequate and where I am flawed, that's where God comes in. And God makes the difference. Where I am weak, he makes me strong. And when you have that kind of faith, it leads to what we would call active obedience. I say that because genuine faith, genuine belief, always leads to action. It's how we actually demonstrate our faith. When we say, I can't, what are we doing? We're operating in fear. And that I can't instinct, that I can't response reveals that we're, living out of fear. Faith says, I can. And when you have that I can do all things through Christ kind of belief, what is the logical next step? It's to do whatever God is calling you to do, right? You don't say, I can, and then sit on your hands. God's, inviting you to join him. I can, but I'm going to sit on my hands and do nothing. No, that doesn't make sense. When you have an I can do all things kind of mentality, you start doing whatever it is that God has called you to do. And that kind of obedience ends the crisis, because where there was fear and where there was doubt and where there was hesitancy, your faith that said, I can do this with the strength of God, with his empowerment, I can do this, you overcome the crisis. So we're going to spend the rest of our time this morning kind of looking at how that works. How do we get to that place where we're able, whatever the struggle is, whatever the obstacle is, we're able to overcome it by faith and join God in his work. How do we get overcoming obedience? And again, we want to go back to Hebrews 11, starting in verse 6 this time. Without faith, can't please God. In our context, God desires this ongoing, personal, intimate, loving relationship with us. He wants to do life together with us. He wants to partner with us. He wants to work not just in us, but through us. That's what he desires. And without faith, it's impossible to believe or to please him, because we have to believe he exists, not a problem. We have to believe when we accept his invitation, that he will reward our obedience and we will see him do exactly what we were hoping for, that we could see by faith, but we couldn't see with sight, because he's working towards the outcome. But we take that first step before we see the outcome. Does that make sense? Okay, so how do we get there? Step one, we have to shift the focus from how to who. And I get why we would hesitate. I already told you, when I'm presented with some kind of task, when I have some kind of opportunity before me, I'm a creature of habit. I have certain routines. This is just how I operate. And so I would evaluate whatever the situation is. I would come up with some kind of a plan that made sense to me, that seemed to be reasonable and rational, so that I could say, yes, this could work. Here's how it could work. It's not that much different than if you think of budgeting. If the goal is, okay, at the end of the month, all my bills are paid and I have some money left over. If that's the goal, okay, what do? You make a budget. I'm going to allocate so much for this and so much for this, so much for this, so that all my expenses are paid. And guess what? When I do the arithmetic, I have some money left over. I can look and see how it's going to work, barring some kind of crazy catastrophe. Well, that's how I look at just about anything. I'll break it down, make a plan, work the plan, and as long as the plan is reasonable, it's like, okay, I can see how this works. That makes sense to me to do that, because if I make the plan and I look at it and say, that's the craziest plan in the world, it'll never work, well, why am I going to do that? So I get why we would be stuck on, how is this going to work? I often get stuck there. Here's the problem when we're talking about these God-sized moments that have created a crisis in our life. We're not responsible for the how. Who's responsible for the how? That would be God. I'm responsible to focus on who he is. I'm responsible to focus on what he is able to do if I simply give him a chance. And I think there is such a great illustration of this back in the Old Testament. Are you familiar with the battle for Jericho? Jericho was the first major obstacle that Israel had to contend with when they entered the Promised Land. It was a walled city. It had fierce armies. It literally was the gateway into the Promised Land. It was close by a known crossing of the Jordan River. They were on the east side of the Jordan. They had to get to the west side. That's where the Promised Land was. And there's a crossing, and right after the crossing is Jericho. And God is calling Israel to deal with Jericho. Here's the plan that God came up with. We're going to have a parade and march around the city once a day for 6 days. And on the seventh day, we're going to extend our parade. We're going to march around 7 times. And at the end of the 7th time, we're going to blow a trumpet and shout. Can you imagine? I don't know of all the great generals in American history, but can you imagine selling that to Ulysses S. Grant? Or, I don't know Sherman's first name. General Sherman, the guy that burned Atlanta. Douglas MacArthur. I'm running out of famous generals. Can you imagine trying to sell that kind of plan to anyone with a brain? I mean, really. Joshua had a brain, right? Joshua was familiar and experienced with warfare. How easy would it have been for Joshua to get hung up on the how? That would be as normal as the sun coming up tomorrow morning. And if he got hung up on the how, he would have missed out on one of the great miracles of the Bible. In fact, in the New Testament, God actually tells us that some of the stuff he does is unorthodox and crazy, like the battle for Jericho, so that we would recognize we did not do that. That can only be explained in one way. God did that. And he tells us that so we don't get too big for our britches. And that's really easy to do. It's really easy for us to become a Nebuchadnezzar and look at things and say, is not this great Babylon which I have built? No. God took the walls of Jericho down, not some wonderful strategy that Joshua came up with. So the first thing we have to do is shift our focus from the how to the who. Second thing we have to do, We have to rename excuses and see them as opportunities where God can work. Now again, I don't think there's anything wrong with identifying problems and identifying obstacles and recognizing, man, there's a gap between what I can do. There's a gap between the resources I have and the amount of energy and the amount of time, all of the limitations that are a part of me, that are a part of you. There's a gap between that and the need of the moment and the task at hand. And that's where we start making excuses. Well, I don't have enough time. I don't have enough money. I don't have enough this, that, or whatever. Right? Nothing wrong with seeing the problems. Don't let the problems lead you into an I can't mentality. And again, another great illustration coming from when Israel went into the Promised Land. You remember the 12 spies? 12 spies go into the land to spy it out. What did they see? They saw a whole lot of positives. Man, this is exactly what Moses told us. It's a land flowing with milk and honey. Does that ever puzzle you? It's like, why do I want a land that's flowing with milk and honey? I'd prefer a land where there's Mercedes in every driveway and prime rib on your dinner plate. That would make better sense to me. Milk and honey, not so much, but Mercedes and prime rib works. But you get the idea. It's everything God said it was, but there's a problem, right? There's walled cities, there's giants, there's fierce armies. We look like grasshoppers to these guys. Now, all the spies saw the same exact reality, right? 10 of them let the obstacles lead them into an I can't mentality. 2 of them, Caleb and Joshua, saw the same obstacles. They saw the giants, they saw the walled cities, they saw the fierce armies. And they said, we should go in. This is going to be a piece of cake. Because they renamed the obstacles and the gaps in their ability, they renamed and saw them as, this is where God's going to work. This is where we're going to see his power. And if you like, remember Paul Harvey say, now for the rest of the story. Well, if you do the now for the rest of the story and you fast forward, Jericho had huge walled cities. Jericho had a fierce army. How well did that defend Jericho against the power of Almighty God? It did not. If we were back with the kiddies, we would sing, the walls of Jericho fell flat, right? Because Jericho's walls and Jericho's armies don't stand a prayer against God's power. Then you think about the giants. How well did Goliath's size and strength and experience in battle and all of his weapons, how well did that do against David, a shepherd boy with a sling? Goliath was no match for God's power. Do not let excuses stop you from seizing the opportunities God has given. Just rename them as, this is where God will work. This is where he will show up. This is where we will see his power. I often ask God to remind us how great he is when I'm praying for something specific, some need. God, remind us how great you are, because it's easy for me to think that's impossible. And with God, nothing is impossible. And I ask him to remind me of that often. Next step in having that overcoming faith, we have to reject a passive faith. What do I mean by a passive faith? A passive faith is much more intellectual than it is experiential. It agrees with theological facts. It agrees with things that we've learned over the years about God. The problem with a passive faith is it doesn't change our behavior. It doesn't change how we live. And there's a difference between believing God can do something and experiencing it. Experiencing it requires us to actually act on our faith and join him in whatever endeavor he's calling us to. And when we join him and his power is seen, and its experience, we go from that, oh yeah, I believe this and I believe that, to I've experienced it. Passive faith is content to believe God can do all things, but it's unwilling to step out. And anytime our faith is passive, anytime it's just, kind of intellectual acceptance of something, we will miss out on an experiential relationship with God. There are no guarantees, if you will. There's no, okay, this is going to work out. There's all kinds of promises that God gives us, and faith acts on those, even though we can't see the outcome yet. That's because faith moves while the outcome is unknown. I can't see the outcome, but I believe in God. I know he loves me. I know the incredible power he has. I know he's calling me to this whatever, and I accept that invitation. I join him in his work, and my faith says the outcome is certain. A passive faith says, I'm going to sit on my hands. I believe God can do it. I just don't believe enough to actually join him. You see the difference? Faith, real faith, doesn't sit on your hands. It joins God, and then it experiences God. And how we do that is all we have to do is take the first step. And I know how cliche it sounds, but the reality is every journey starts with a first step. And it's that first step that breaks the crisis, that allows us to move forward. And as soon as we take that first step, all kinds of good things start to happen. First of all, God is able to reveal himself more and more. Why? Because he's looking at us and he recognizes, okay, that guy's listening. And he's trustworthy because when I called him to this, he joined me. So he's listening. I know I can trust him. And so I am going to reveal more and more of what I want to do through him. Secondly, we take that first step. We start experiencing God's faithfulness. The world did not end. I didn't die. It wasn't as bad as I thought. Because that's the kind of stuff we think is going to happen. It's like, oh man, I can't do that. It will be so embarrassing. It'll be a colossal failure. And like I said, we've got all kinds of excuses why it's a bad idea and why it won't work. And you take that first step and it's, wow, that wasn't as bad as I thought it was going to be. And that makes it so much easier. Because remember, I don't know if it was last week, the week before, one of the recent studies, we talked about life as a journey. And we often want to know what's going on at step 10 or step 50 or step 100. And God often doesn't reveal all that. He's focused back here because step 1 prepares us for step 2, and step 2 prepares us for step 3, and 3 for 4, and 4 for 5, etc. And step 10, 20, 50, they're going to take care of themselves as I step 1, 2, and 3. So when I take that first step, all of a sudden, I've developed some spiritual momentum where I'm experiencing God's power working through me, and that makes it easier to take all the next steps that are coming my way. But as you contemplate that, let me give you a word of caution. You probably better buckle your seatbelt, because things are about to change. They have to. Because you can't step into whatever God's calling to you, whatever assignment he has for you. You can't step into that and hang on to your same old routine. Something has to give. The more we move away from self-direction and self-centeredness towards a God-directed, God-centered life, something has to give. You're going to have to make some changes. And it won't be, if I can explain, it won't be grudgingly. It won't be burdensome. That's if we go all the way back to the beginning of our study. That's the difference between religion and relationship. When I do things to demonstrate to my wife that I love her, I don't do them because I have to, and I don't do them because of some sense of responsibility. I do them because I love her. I mean, I thought that's the way it works. When you love someone, it's easy to do stuff that shows them that you love them. And that's the same way it is with God. And so when we talk about, well, what kind of adjustments are going to need to be made? Well, probably the first one and the biggest one, because the greatest battle we ever face is in our mind, we're going to have to start looking at life through God's lens rather than the sight, reasonable, rational, logical lens that most of us look through to kind of, do life. No, I need to start seeing life through God's lens. Because when I look at it through Vince's lens, I see a lot of limitations that lead to the idea of, well, I can't because, and then you fill in the blank. So I'm going to have to change how I think. I'm going to have to change how I allocate my time and my money and my talents and my energy. Certainly my behavior is going to change because I'm looking at life through God's lens, and I'm looking to join him in his work. And so my behaviors and my daily routines are going to all reflect that. How I allocate my time and my money and my talents, it's all going to change. I'm not going to have a passive faith. I'm going to have this active, obedient faith. My relationships will probably change. Again, they almost have to. If I'm living in my comfort zone around these people, and God is stretching me and calling me to some endeavor, guess what? There's some people over here. And so God's going to be calling me towards these people that need to be loved, and he's trying to love them through me, but that might mean he pulls me away from some stuff over here. So my relationships are going to change. Almost by definition, and the reason I say buckle your seatbelt is when you actually take up God's invitation to join him, there almost has to be times when you surrender your will to his. There'll be times when he calls you to sacrifice in some way. There'll be times when you are confronted with risk because that endeavor is unknown and potentially quite scary. And you're going to have to deal with the sacrifice and the surrender and the risk. But I would say it's absolutely worth it. Because some of the greatest moments in biblical history started with a crisis. Story of Noah. I'm going to flood the earth. Noah, you've got a job to do. We talked about the Battle of Jericho. First obstacle in the goal of possessing the promised land. Think of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. You need to bow down to this idol, or we're going to throw you in the fiery furnace. Daniel, you need to stop praying to your God, or we're going to throw you in with a bunch of hungry lions. Or coming into the New Testament, you can stay in the boat, or you can walk on water. Every one of those things started with a crisis. And when the crisis was overcome, and the response was obedience, every one of them ended with the individuals involved experiencing the kind of things that only God can do. In every example, it ends with a miracle. And you wouldn't have ever seen the miracle if you didn't go through the crisis. Now, that doesn't change the fact that the invitation creates a crisis. There wouldn't be any crisis if it wasn't scary. If we couldn't look at it 10 different ways and keep coming to the same conclusion, oh, I can't do that, I can't do that, I can't do that. It's scary. It's risky because you're looking at the unknown, and we're comfortable with the status quo. So it's scary, but as I said, it's worth it. So the next time you face a crisis, you sense God is calling you, look beyond that moment through faith. Envision what God can do if you just give him the chance. And if you will just take that first step, he will give you everything you need, not just for that first step, but he'll give you everything you need to take the next step and the next step and the next step. But as I said, buckle your seatbelt, because you're now embarking on this great adventure. And what's so great about the adventure is, in the adventure, you see the kind of things that only he can do. We've seen a lot of stuff that we can do. How cool is it when we see the stuff? There's only one way to explain that. I don't know. I'd have to sit down and take a long time to count the moments in my life where it's like, only God can explain that. But if you've had even one of those moments, you know what I'm talking about, and life doesn't get any better than that. When you're a follower of God and you have those kinds of moments, it is the best thing you've ever experienced, and it makes you hungry and thirsty for more. It's like, I want that every single day. And maybe not the most dramatic ones, but we can experience God every single day if we are able to hear his voice when he calls and join him in his ongoing work. Let's pray. Father, thank you so much for these scriptures and the encouragement we find in them. It is so very easy for us to think something is wrong with us when we have doubt, when we have hesitancy, when we have fear. And none of those things are the problem. The problem is when we allow them to control us. Because instead of focusing on the who, we focus on the how. Instead of looking at the moment and recognizing nothing is impossible with God, we make excuses. Father, we want to experience you. But sometimes following where you are calling us to go is scary and risky. But there's nothing better than being with you and being able to see the kind of things that only you can do. And there's only one way to get there. And that is, we have to accept that invitation by faith. We can't see the outcome, but we believe in you so much that we'll take that first step. May that be what defines each one of us in the days and weeks ahead, so that in the journey, you remind us over and over how great you are by what we see you doing. I lift this up in Jesus' name. Amen. Thank you.